Before he was a name that made bankers tremble and generals bow, before silk robes and diamond cufflinks and a fleet of bodyguards who would kill on a whisper from his lips, he was a boy standing barefoot in the mud of a fruit stall, watching the Huangpu River carry away everything he would ever know. Shanghai in the early 1900s was a city split down the middle, foreign concessions gleaming with gaslight and imported wine on one side, and on the other, alleys so poor that children were sold for silver and men vanished into the river without a splash of protest. He came from the second Shanghai. And by the time he was done, he owned both. This is the story of Du Yuesheng, the orphan who became the Opium King, the gangster who dined with generals, financed a revolution, and built an empire on smoke, blood, and fear so total that even the word "no" disappeared from the vocabulary of everyone who crossed him. They called him Big-Eared Du, and for 30 years, Shanghai belonged to him. Before we step into the fog of old Shanghai, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is right now wherever you are. I read every single one, and there's something strange and wonderful about knowing this story is reaching people across every time zone on Earth, all sitting in the dark together, about to walk into the underworld. Alright. Lock the doors. Pour something strong. This is the story of Du Yuesheng. Gaochia was not a place that appeared on any map worth printing. It was a scatter of low huts on the eastern bank of the Huangpu River, in a stretch of marshland called Pudong that the wealthy of Shanghai never had reason to visit. In 1888, when Du Yuesheng was born there, Pudong was mud and reeds and the smell of fish drying in the sun, a world away from the gaslit boulevards rising across the water in the international settlement and the French concession, where European traders were building a city of profit on top of a country they had bled for opium 2 generations earlier. The irony of that geography, a boy born in the shadow of the opium trade's original crime scene, who would grow up to become its most powerful lord, is the kind of detail history sometimes hands you for free, as if even fate wanted this story told. His family had nothing. His father ran a small rice shop that never quite rose above subsistence, the kind of business that keeps a family fed but never safe, never one bad season away from ruin. And ruin came early and it came hard. His mother died when he was a small child. Not long after, his father followed her, worn down by poverty or illness. The records are thin here, the way records are always thin for the poor, because no one thought to write down the details of a rice merchant's death in a marshland village. What we know is that by the time Du Yuesheng was still a boy, both of his parents were gone, and he was left in Shanghai with a stepmother and later an aunt, passed between relatives the way unwanted furniture gets passed between rooms. Picture him at 8, 9, 10 years old. Skinny. Big ears that stuck out from his head, the feature that would later become his most famous nickname, Big-Eared Du, though in those years it was simply the kind of thing other children mocked him for. No formal schooling to speak of. No trade passed down from a father who was no longer alive to teach him one. What he had was the street, and the street in early 20th century Shanghai was not a place that raised gentlemen. He started as a fruit seller. It is almost too perfect a detail for a story like this. The future opium lord of Asia, the man who would one day control the flow of narcotics worth more than the treasuries of small nations, spent his childhood hawking fruit from a cart in the Pudong markets, later crossing the river to sell in the alleys of the French concession itself. He got good at it, or good enough that some who knew him then remembered him as clever with numbers, quick with his hands, sharp-eyed in a way that missed nothing. He was especially fond, the old stories say, of a particular local fruit, and some accounts claim this is where an early nickname came from, Fruit Yuesheng, a boy known on the street corners not by his family name, which meant nothing, but by the goods he carried on his back. But fruit selling in the Shalupu docks was not a career. It was a holding pattern, a way to stay alive while the city decided what to do with you. And Shalupu itself was not a gentle classroom. It was one of the roughest stretches of waterfront in all of Shanghai, a tangle of docks, warehouses, opium dens, gambling houses, and brothels where sailors, laborers, smugglers, and petty criminals rubbed shoulders every night. A boy who wanted to survive there did not survive by being soft. He survived by learning who to fear, who to flatter, who to avoid, and who could be persuaded, with the right words or the right silence, to look the other way. It was in this world, not the polished boulevards of the concessions, but the mud and shadow of the docks, that young Yuesheng began to disappear from the honest economy entirely. He drifted, as so many poor young men in that Shanghai did, toward gambling. Not as a hobby. As an obsession. Those who wrote about him later, both his admirers and his enemies, agreed on this much: gambling was in his blood from an early age, a hunger that never fully left him even decades later when he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. In his teenage years he threw himself into it completely, hustling for stakes, learning the rhythms of dice and cards and the particular psychology of men desperate enough to bet away what little they had. He lost as often as he won, probably more often. And it was through this reckless, restless gambling life that the door to the underworld finally opened for him, not with a bang, but the way most doors to hell open, through a friend who seemed, at the time, like nothing more than a friend. Among the gamblers and hustlers he ran with was a man remembered in the old accounts by a nickname that has survived better than his real one, Lot Drawer, a fellow gambler who moonlighted as a pimp and who saw something in the skinny, sharp-eyed young do that others had missed. Ambition, maybe. Or hunger. Or simply the particular kind of ruthlessness that doesn't announce itself in a boy's face but shows itself in small moments: how he settled a debt, how he handled being cheated, how quickly he stopped flinching. Whatever Lot Drawer saw, he decided it was worth investing in. He sponsored Du's initiation into a secret brotherhood that had been operating in the shadows of the Yangtze Delta for over half a century, the Green Gang. To understand what Du Yuesheng was walking into, you have to understand what the Green Gang actually was, because it was not simply a street gang in the way that phrase suggests today. Its roots reached back generations, tangled up in the history of the boatmen who worked the Grand Canal, the great inland waterway that had carried grain and goods the length of China for 1,000 years. Those boatmen, over the centuries, had organized themselves into secret brotherhoods for mutual protection, brotherhoods that drew on the mysticism of a religious sect founded centuries earlier by a spiritual teacher named Luo Qing. By the time it reached the alleys of Shanghai in the early 20th century, the Green Gang carried with it the weight of that long, strange lineage, part criminal syndicate, part secret religious brotherhood, part mutual aid society, with its own hierarchy of masters and disciples, its own initiation rites, its own unbreakable codes of loyalty and its own brutal punishments for those who broke them. For a poor, parentless boy from Pudong with no family name worth anything and no trade to fall back on, the Green Gang offered something he had never had in his life: a structure. A ladder. A family, of a twisted and dangerous kind, but a family nonetheless, one with rules he could learn, obligations he could fulfill, and a hierarchy he could, if he was smart and ruthless enough, climb. He entered its lowest rungs in his early to mid-teens or early 20s depending on which account you trust, and the work he was given there was exactly the kind of work you'd expect for a new initiate with no name and no money, running numbers for illegal lotteries, extorting small shopkeepers for protection, and dealing small amounts of opium on the corners near the docks. It was petty, dirty, dangerous work, the kind that could get a boy killed in an alley on any given night for a debt of a few coins. He was, in these years, nobody, one more disposable young tough in a city that manufactured them by the thousands, chewed them up, and spat out the bones into the Huangpu River without ceremony. But Du Yuesheng was watching. That is the thread that runs through every account of his early years, the one trait every biographer agrees on regardless of whether they admired him or despised him: he watched everything, and he watched patiently. He watched which men in the Green Gang held real power and which merely postured. He watched how money moved through the opium trade, who took a cut and who took the risk. He watched the foreign police in the French concession, how they could be bought, how a bribe delivered with the right etiquette bought more protection than any amount of muscle. He was building, in those years of dirty, low-level work, an education that no school in Shanghai could have given him, an education in exactly how power actually functioned in a city where the law belonged to foreigners, the government belonged to warlords, and the only truly reliable currency was fear, favors, and cash. And then came the meeting that would change everything. The dominant figure in the Shanghai underworld in those years was a man named Huang Jinrong, a name that struck genuine fear into the hearts of ordinary Shanghai residents. Huang was an extraordinary and almost unbelievable figure even by the standards of this story, a Chinese detective working for the French concession's own police force, and simultaneously one of the most powerful gang bosses in the entire city. He held both roles at once, using his official position to protect his criminal empire and using his criminal empire to enforce order the French authorities were happy to let him enforce, so long as their own interests were served and their own hands stayed clean. Everyone called him pock-marked Huang, and everyone, from street peddlers to French officials, understood that his word in certain corners of Shanghai carried more weight than any courts. Yuesheng, still a minor player, still nobody, came into Huang's orbit through the gambling world. His gambling had introduced him to countless disreputable corners of the city, and Huang's operations touched nearly all of them. But the detail that the old accounts return to again and again, the detail that reads almost like fiction but appears to be true, is that it was not Huang himself who first noticed Du and decided he was worth elevating. It was Huang's wife. Her name was Lin Yuesheng, and she was a formidable figure in her own right, a former brothel madam who had built her own fortune and reputation running Shanghai's lucrative night soil collection trade, the unglamorous but surprisingly profitable business of collecting human waste from the city for use as fertilizer, a trade that in a city of over 1 million people generated real money for whoever controlled it. She was shrewd, she was tough, and by every account, she took an immediate liking to the young, fruit Yuesheng, perhaps his manners, perhaps his sharpness, perhaps simply an instinct that this particular skinny young hustler had something the others didn't. Whatever it was, she began pushing her husband to give the boy real responsibility, not the disposable street work he'd been doing, but something closer to the center of the operation. Huang listened to his wife. It was one of the more consequential decisions in the history of Chinese organized crime, though of course nobody involved could have known it at the time. Du was given management of a small opium den, a modest assignment, a test, really, to see whether the sharp-eyed young man everyone kept talking about could actually run something. He passed the test. He proved himself capable, careful, and, crucially, in a business built on discretion, trustworthy in the particular way that criminal organizations define trustworthiness. He didn't steal, he didn't talk, and he got results. That success earned him something far bigger. He was brought in to help manage one of Huang's largest and most important opium dens, located inside the French concession itself, the beating financial heart of Huang's empire, a den that operated under the direct protection of the French police, purchased with a steady flow of silver and favors that ensured official eyes stayed conveniently closed. This was not petty street corner dealing anymore. This was the real machinery of the opium trade, the actual mechanism by which a French colonial police force and a Chinese secret society had reached a quiet, profitable understanding. The gangs would keep a version of order in the concession's underworld, and in exchange, the opium would keep flowing and the French administrators would keep collecting their share, all without a single official document ever admitting any of it existed. For more than a decade, Du Yuesheng served in this capacity as Huang Jinrong's trusted lieutenant. He collected profits. He enforced discipline among the gang's rank and file, which in practice meant he learned, intimately, personally, with his own hands when necessary, the mechanics of violence as a business tool. He intimidated shopkeepers who resisted paying protection money. He kept the books straight on an operation that generated enormous, illegal cash flow and could never be allowed anywhere near an actual bank ledger. He built, patiently, over years, a network of loyalty and obligation that stretched from the lowest opium runner to men several rungs above him in the hierarchy. And he changed, too, in ways both visible and invisible. The threadbare fruit seller from Pudong began dressing in fine Chinese silk. He surrounded himself, in a detail that still startles people who hear it for the first time, with bodyguards recruited from the community of white Russian refugees who had fled to Shanghai after the fall of the Tsar, displaced, desperate men with military training and nothing left to lose, exactly the kind of muscle a rising gangster wanted at his shoulder. He became a fixture at the city's most exclusive nightclubs and sing-song houses, the elegant entertainment venues where Shanghai's elite, foreign and Chinese, legitimate and criminal, mixed over wine and music. He was becoming known. He was becoming, in the particular vocabulary of that underworld, a man of face, someone whose name carried weight, whose favor was worth currying, whose displeasure was worth avoiding at almost any cost. But for all of that transformation, for all the silk and the bodyguards and the nightclub tables, Yuesheng in these years was still, fundamentally, someone else's man. He was Huang Jinrong's lieutenant. The empire he was helping to run was not his empire. The name on the door, so to speak, still belonged to pock-marked Huang, and there is no evidence that anyone in Shanghai in the late 1910s or early 1920s, not the French police, not the rival gangs, not even Du's own gambling friends from his teenage years, imagined that this quiet, watchful, meticulously loyal lieutenant would one day eclipse his master entirely and become the single most powerful gangster in the history of modern China. That transformation was coming. It would arrive through crisis, through a single act of reckless violence committed by Huang Jinrong himself, an act that would nearly destroy the empire Du had spent a decade helping to build, and that would hand Du Yuesheng, almost by accident, the opportunity of his life. A cell door. A humiliated warlord. And a young lieutenant who understood, better than anyone else in Shanghai, exactly what a favor delivered at the right moment could be worth. Power in Shanghai's underworld was never a fixed thing. It looked solid from the outside, the silk robes, the private cars, the deference bowed by shopkeepers and street sweepers alike, but underneath it was a house built on sand, on 1,000 unspoken understandings between gangsters, warlords, and colonial police who had every reason to protect each other and every reason, given the right pressure, to abandon each other in an instant. Huang Jinrong had built his empire on exactly that fragile foundation, a Chinese detective inside a French police force, running a criminal syndicate with one hand while enforcing French law with the other, trusting that no one with enough power to challenge that contradiction would ever bother to try. In 1924, someone did. The story of Huang's fall has been told in slightly different versions depending on who is telling it, but the shape of it is consistent enough to trust. It began, as so many disasters in old Shanghai began, with a woman. Huang Jinrong, for all his cunning in the underworld, made the catastrophic mistake of becoming entangled with a young actress, some accounts call her a singer, others a performer of a more particular kind, who had caught the eye of a far more dangerous man than any gangster in Shanghai, the son of a warlord general with real military power behind him, a man not remotely interested in observing the delicate unwritten rules that governed relations between Shanghai's criminal bosses and its officials. When Huang, drunk on his own reputation and perhaps genuinely infatuated, refused to step aside gracefully, the warlord's son did not respond the way a rival gangster would have, with a knife in an alley, a message sent through the usual channels of underworld diplomacy. He responded with the blunt, unanswerable force of actual military authority. Huang Jinrong was seized, humiliated, and thrown into custody, stripped in a single stroke of the invincibility that had protected him for 2 decades. For the empire Huang had built, this was catastrophic. A criminal syndicate is only as strong as the fear its leader inspires, and fear evaporates the instant the leader is shown to be just another man who can be dragged off the street and locked in a cell like anyone else. Word of Huang's arrest spread through the Shanghai underworld within hours. Rival gangs began circling. Nervous subordinates began wondering whether their loyalty had just become a very dangerous liability. Business partners who had spent years currying favor with Huang began quietly asking themselves who they would need to curry favor with next. The entire structure, the dens, the gambling houses, the protection rackets, the carefully negotiated arrangement with the French police, stood on the edge of collapse, waiting to see whether anyone had the nerve and the resources to hold it together. This is the moment that every serious account of Du Yuesheng's life returns to as the true beginning of his rise, not a moment of violence, not a dramatic betrayal, but a moment of pure, cold-blooded opportunity recognized and seized while everyone around him panicked. While other lieutenants scrambled and postured and worried about their own skins, Du Yuesheng did something almost nobody in the underworld expected of him. He acted decisively, and he acted in his master's defense. He understood, with the clarity that would define his entire career, that the crisis was not actually about Huang Jinrong's freedom. It was about who would be seen to have saved him. Whoever engineered Huang's release, whoever could walk into that cell corridor, or arrange for someone else to, and produced the outcome that no one else in the underworld had been able to produce, would inherit something far more valuable than Huang's gratitude. They would inherit the perception of power itself, the unmistakable proof, broadcast through every tea-house and opium den in the city, that they were now a man capable of moving mountains that lesser men could only stare at helplessly. Due through every resource he had into securing Huang's release. He called in favors that had been accumulating quietly for over a decade of loyal, patient service, favors owed by fellow gang members, by corrupt officials who had taken his silver over the years, by the network of contacts he had built managing that opium den in the French concession. He negotiated, he bribed, he leaned on relationships that had been cultivated so carefully and so invisibly that even Huang himself likely had no full picture of how extensive Du's web of contacts had already become. And it worked. Huang Jinrong walked free. On the surface, nothing had changed. Huang was still the boss. He returned to his empire, resumed his position, and by most external appearances the old order simply reasserted itself, as if the whole episode had been nothing more than an embarrassing interruption. But underneath the surface, everything had changed, and everyone in the Shanghai underworld understood it, even if no one said it aloud. Huang Jinrong had been shown, in the most public and humiliating way possible, to be vulnerable, capable of being seized, stripped of his authority, and held at the mercy of a rival with real institutional power. And Du Yuesheng had been shown to be the man who could reach into a crisis like that and pull victory out of it. In the underworld's brutal arithmetic, where reputation is currency and fear is the only truly stable form of wealth, that single episode transferred something invisible but enormous from Huang's ledger to Du's. Huang, whether out of genuine gratitude or a shrewd recognition that resisting the shift would only accelerate his own decline, began stepping back from active management of the gang's daily operations. Some accounts suggest his health and his nerve had genuinely been shaken by the humiliation of the arrest, that the ordeal had cost him something he never fully recovered, the particular fearlessness that had let him run a criminal empire and a police badge simultaneously for 20 years without ever flinching. Whatever the cause, the effect was unmistakable. A vacuum was opening at the top of Shanghai's underworld, and Du Yuesheng, patient and watchful as he had always been, was standing exactly where that vacuum would pull him. He did not seize the vacuum through violence, and this detail matters enormously to understanding the particular kind of gangster Du Yuesheng became. He was not, at his core, a man who ruled through raw physical terror the way some of his contemporaries did. He ruled through organization, through alliance, through the careful, almost bureaucratic construction of monopoly. His genius, and it is not too strong a word, was recognizing that Shanghai's opium trade in the mid-1920s was fragmented, inefficient, and constantly bleeding money through internal competition. Dozens of smaller operators, dens, and smuggling networks were all fighting over the same customers, undercutting each other's prices, occasionally sparking violent turf disputes that drew unwanted attention from the very authorities everyone needed to keep quiet. It was, from a purely business perspective, a mess. And Du Yuesheng understood, years before anyone else in that world seemed to grasp it fully, that the real fortune to be made was not in winning that chaotic competition. It was in ending it. He began building what would come to be remembered as one of the most audacious criminal consolidations in the history of the Chinese underworld, an alliance that would bring the competing opium interests of Shanghai's French concession under a single, unified structure, eliminating the wasteful violence of competition and replacing it with an orderly, almost corporate monopoly. This was not simply a matter of intimidating rivals into submission, though intimidation certainly played its part. It was a matter of persuasion, negotiation, and the careful construction of mutual interest, convincing rival operators that they would make more money as partners in a monopoly than as competitors fighting over scraps, and backing that persuasion with the unmistakable understanding that refusal carried consequences no sensible man wanted to test. Central to this consolidation was an alliance with another rising figure in the Green Gang hierarchy, a man named Zhang Xiaolin, who brought his own network of contacts and enforcers to the table. Together with Huang Jinrong, who remained a senior, respected figure even as his direct control waned, the three men formed what would become one of the most feared and successful partnerships in Shanghai's history, a triumvirate that Shanghai residents would come to speak of in hushed tones for the next 2 decades. Huang Jinrong, Du Yuesheng, and Zhang Xiaolin. Three names that, spoken together, meant absolute control over the vice economy of the richest city in China. The mechanics of what they built deserve to be understood in some detail, because this was not simply gangsterism in the crude sense, it was an economic empire constructed with real sophistication. Opium flowed into Shanghai from multiple sources, smuggled in from the poppy fields of Sichuan province in China's interior and from India under British colonial production, arriving by river, by rail, by coastal shipping routes that had to be bribed and negotiated at every checkpoint along the way. Once it reached Shanghai, the trade's genius, and its protection, lay in a simple geographic and legal trick. The opium was stored not in Chinese-controlled territory, where Chinese law technically prohibited it, and not entirely within French-controlled territory either, but strategically within the international settlement, an area of the city under a peculiar and confused multinational jurisdiction where neither Chinese nor any single foreign power could claim clean, uncontested legal authority. In that jurisdictional fog, in the gap between overlapping and often uncooperative legal systems, an enormous illegal trade could operate with something approaching impunity, so long as the right officials on every side of every border were paid to look elsewhere. Yuesheng understood this legal architecture better than perhaps anyone else in the city, and he built his organization to exploit it with ruthless efficiency. The dens themselves operated under the tacit protection of the French concession police, an arrangement purchased through a steady and reliable stream of bribes that Du managed personally, understanding that this relationship, more than any gun, any knife, any bodyguard, was the true foundation of his entire empire. French officers who might have shut down an opium operation on any given night instead found reasons to look elsewhere, reasons that arrived, month after month, in the form of silver dollars delivered through channels so well established they had become almost administrative in their regularity. Profits from this near monopoly on opium became the seed capital for an even broader empire. Du and his partners diversified aggressively, recognizing early that gambling represented an enormous, underexploited opportunity in a city full of desperate men and idle wealth alike. They established and expanded gambling dens across the concession, structures that ranged from squalid back alley operations catering to dock workers and laborers, all the way up to lavish, glittering casinos that drew Shanghai's wealthiest residents and its community of foreign expatriates, all of them equally willing to lose fortunes at Du's tables. Prostitution networks followed a similar pattern of expansion and consolidation, brought under increasingly centralized control, generating steady revenue and, just as importantly, generating leverage, information, and influence, since the brothels and sing-song houses of Shanghai were also where secrets were traded, where officials and businessmen let their guard down, and where a man who controlled the rooms controlled, in a very real sense, the conversations happening inside them. And then there was the protection racket, the oldest and simplest form of gangster income, but one that Du expanded with the same organizational discipline he brought to everything else. Shopkeepers, merchants, and business owners throughout the areas under Green Gang influence paid regular tribute, not always through open threat but often through a far more chilling mechanism, the simple, universal understanding of what happened to those who didn't pay. Fires that mysteriously started. Merchandise that mysteriously vanished. Family members who mysteriously encountered trouble in the street. Yuesheng rarely needed to deliver these messages personally. His reputation, carefully built and constantly reinforced by his enforcers, did the work for him. By the mid to late 1920s, the transformation was essentially complete. The man who had once sold fruit from a cart in the Pudong markets, who had once run numbers for pennies in the alleys of Shalupu, who had spent over a decade as a loyal but subordinate lieutenant to Huang Jinrong, had become, in practical terms, if not always in formal title, the most powerful figure in the entire arrangement. Huang Jinrong remained a respected elder statesman of the underworld, a man whose seniority commanded genuine deference, but the daily machinery of power, the actual levers of money and violence and influence that made Shanghai's underworld function, increasingly ran through Du Yuesheng's hands. Zhang Xiaolin remained an important partner and enforcer, but even he understood, as did everyone else in that world, whose judgment now carried the final word when the triumvirate disagreed. Yuesheng was, by this point, unrecognizable from the boy who had grown up parentless in a marshland village across the river. He lived across multiple residences in the city's most desirable districts, properties acquired through purchase, through gift, through the particular kind of transaction that occurs when a man of Du's reputation expresses interest in something a lesser man happens to own. He entertained lavishly. He dressed in silk that announced his status to anyone with eyes to see it. He surrounded himself not only with his white Russian bodyguards but with an expanding circle of scholars, artists, opera performers, and cultural figures whom he patronized generously, a detail that surprised many who expected nothing but brutality from Shanghai's Opium King, but which reveals something important about the particular kind of power Du Yuesheng was building. He was not content to be merely feared. He wanted to be respected, even admired, in circles that had nothing to do with the underworld at all. He wanted, in the deepest sense, legitimacy, a word that would come to define much of his later ambition, and that would eventually pull him into far more dangerous territory than opium dens and gambling houses ever could. Because fear and money, Du Yuesheng understood better than almost any gangster of his era, were not the ceiling of what a man could achieve in a city like Shanghai. They were the floor. Above that floor sat something far more valuable and far more dangerous to reach for, real political power, the kind that could not be bought with silver alone but had to be built through alliance with men who commanded armies, who could reshape the fate of an entire nation, and who, crucially, needed exactly the kind of muscle, money, and ruthless organizational capacity that Du Yuesheng now commanded in abundance. There was a man rising through the ranks of Chinese nationalist politics in these same years, a military officer with ambitions that stretched far beyond Shanghai, who had spent time in the city's underworld circles in his own younger years and who understood precisely what a partnership with Du Yuesheng's organization could offer a political movement that needed money, muscle, and the particular kind of ruthless efficiency that legitimate armies were often too slow or too principled to provide. His name was Chiang Kai-shek. And the alliance that would eventually form between Du Yuesheng and Chiang would not merely expand Du's criminal empire, it would drag him directly into one of the bloodiest and most consequential political massacres in 20th-century Chinese history, an act of violence so significant that it would alter the entire trajectory of the Chinese Revolution, and that would permanently transform Du Yuesheng from a regional crime boss into a man whose name belonged in the history books of the nation itself, not merely the history of Shanghai's underworld. That transformation, the moment Du Yuesheng stopped being merely a gangster and became a political force capable of shaping the destiny of China, is where the next chapter of this story begins. Because in the spring of 1927, on a single bloody night, Du's men would walk into the headquarters of Shanghai's labor movement, and what happened there would echo through Chinese history for the rest of the century. But that story deserves its own telling, in full, without rushing. By the spring of 1927, China was a country tearing itself apart from the inside, and Shanghai, wealthy, chaotic, half foreign, half forgotten by its own government, sat directly in the path of that tearing. For more than a decade the country had been fractured among competing warlords, each controlling their own patchwork of territory, each answering to no one but themselves. Out of that chaos, a nationalist movement had been slowly gathering strength, determined to reunify China under a single government. That movement was led, at least in its military dimension, by a disciplined, ambitious officer named Chiang Kai-shek, commander of the nationalist forces, the Kuomintang, who had spent the previous 2 years leading what came to be called the Northern Expedition, a military campaign sweeping up from the south with the explicit goal of crushing the warlords and bringing all of China under nationalist control. But the nationalist movement itself was not united. It was an uneasy alliance between two factions who agreed on almost nothing except their shared hatred of the warlord system, the right wing of the Kuomintang, led by men like Chiang who believed in a strong, centralized, capitalist nationalist state, and the left wing, increasingly influenced and infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party, which had entered into a fragile and always suspicious alliance with the nationalists for the sake of the larger revolutionary project. As Chiang's armies pushed north and east through 1926 and into 1927, this internal contradiction became impossible to ignore. Chiang needed the communists' organizational skill among workers and peasants to soften resistance ahead of his troops. But he also, correctly, understood the communists as a long-term existential threat to the kind of China he intended to build, one where capital, commerce, and a strong military state, not worker councils and peasant collectives, held the real power. Shanghai was the flashpoint where this contradiction would finally explode, and the reason was simple: Shanghai's labor movement, powered by hundreds of thousands of factory and dock workers laboring in brutal conditions in the city's foreign-owned mills and shipyards, had become one of the most organized and militant in all of China, and it was substantially under communist influence. In March 1927, as Chiang's nationalist forces approached the city from the south, Shanghai's General Labor Union, led by a committed and effective organizer named Wang Shouhua, orchestrated a general strike and armed uprising that seized control of the Chinese-administered districts of the city before Chiang's own troops had even arrived. It was, in its way, a stunning success for the labor movement, a demonstration that Shanghai's workers could take the city themselves, without waiting for anyone's army to liberate it for them. That success terrified precisely the people whose support Chiang Kai-shek needed most if his new government was going to survive and function: Shanghai's foreign business community, its Chinese industrialists and bankers, the wealthy elite who controlled the actual money that any functioning government would require. A Shanghai run by an armed, communist-influenced labor union was, to these interests, an unacceptable outcome, arguably worse than the chaos of warlordism it was meant to replace. And Chiang understood, with the cold calculation that defined his entire political career, that if he wanted Shanghai's capital and Shanghai's cooperation, he could not simply arrive as a liberator standing shoulder to shoulder with the armed workers who had just seized the city in his name. He needed those armed workers disarmed, their leadership broken, their organization crushed, and he needed it done quickly, decisively, and in a way that did not implicate his own uniformed army directly in slaughtering the very workers whose uprising had helped clear his path into the city. This is where Yuesheng enters the story of modern Chinese political history, not merely as a gangster running opium dens in a foreign concession, but as an instrument of national consequence. Chiang Kai-shek was not a stranger to Shanghai's underworld. In his younger years, before his rise to military command, he had spent time in the city's demimonde, moving in circles that touched the edges of the Green Gang's world, and some accounts suggest he had even undergone a form of informal association with the gang during those earlier years, enough, at minimum, to understand exactly what men like Du Yuesheng, Huang Jinrong, and Zhang Xiaolin were capable of delivering, and enough for those men to see in Chiang not merely a rising warlord but a partner whose success could elevate their own status from criminal to something approaching legitimate power. The arrangement that formed between Chiang and the Green Gang triumvirate in the spring of 1927 was, in retrospect, almost elegantly brutal in its logic. Chiang's own uniformed forces could not be seen massacring the armed workers who controlled the city. The political cost, both domestically and in the eyes of the wider world watching events in China, would have been catastrophic, tainting his new government from its very first days as a regime built on the bodies of the workers who had helped bring it to power. But a criminal organization, operating in the shadows, answering to no government and no press, carried no such burden. A massacre carried out by gangsters could be characterized, however implausibly, as underworld violence, gang warfare, chaos of the kind that plagued Shanghai regardless of who held political power. Chiang needed deniability. Du Yuesheng and his partners could provide it, and in exchange, they stood to receive something they had never possessed before, no matter how much money or muscle they commanded, the explicit backing and protection of what would soon become the government of China itself. Du, Huang, and Zhang formed an organization with an almost bureaucratically bland name, the Chinese Mutual Progress Association, that functioned as a front, a paramilitary body dressed up in the language of civic cooperation but built entirely from the muscle of the Green Gang, its foot soldiers drawn from the same enforcers, den managers, and street toughs who had spent years collecting protection money and running opium through the alleys of the French concession. This was the instrument through which the coming violence would be delivered. On the night of April 11, 1927, the machinery moved. Du Yuesheng, according to the accounts that have survived, invited Wang Shouhua, the very leader of the labor union whose successful uprising had triggered this entire crisis, to his own residence, ostensibly for some manner of negotiation or discussion, an invitation extended with the kind of practiced, courteous menace that Du had spent 2 decades perfecting. Wang came. Whatever his suspicions may have been, whatever calculations led him to walk into the private residence of Shanghai's most powerful gangster in the middle of a political crisis this volatile, he came anyway, and it would be the last decision he ever made freely. Inside Du's residence, Wang Shouhua was seized by Du's men, among them his trusted lieutenant Wan Molan, and in a scene of horrifying, intimate brutality, was strangled, not shot, not stabbed in the anonymity of a dark street, but choked to death, close and personal, inside the private walls of the very mansion where Yuesheng entertained his guests and conducted his business. It was an execution delivered not by distant soldiers following orders but by men who had shaken this leader's hand, who had perhaps offered him tea, who then closed their hands around his throat in a room built for hospitality. Wang's body was disposed of, and Shanghai's most effective and most dangerous labor leader, the man whose organizing had just handed Chiang Kai-shek a city, was simply gone. That single killing was the opening note of what followed over the coming hours and days, an event that would come to be remembered in Chinese history as the Shanghai massacre, or the April 12 incident. In the early morning hours, Green Gang gunmen dressed in ordinary civilian clothes but carrying rifles supplied through Chiang's military connections moved through the working-class districts of the city where the labor union's armed pickets had established themselves. They attacked union headquarters, workers' militia posts, and organizing offices throughout the Chinese districts of Shanghai, opening fire on men who, days earlier, had been celebrated as revolutionary heroes for seizing the city ahead of Chiang's arrival. The workers' militia, caught almost entirely by surprise, many of them had assumed that Chiang's approaching nationalist army was their ally, not their executioner, was overwhelmed within hours. Hundreds were killed in the initial assault alone, gunned down in the streets, in union halls, in their own homes, by men wearing no uniform, answering to no visible chain of command, but operating with a coordination and a supply of weapons that made their true sponsorship impossible to seriously doubt. The killing did not stop with that first night. In the days and weeks that followed, Chiang's own nationalist forces, having entered the city in the wake of the Green Gang's initial assault, conducted a broader and more systematic purge, rounding up suspected communists, labor organizers, and left-wing sympathizers, executing many of them in mass killings that historians estimate claimed thousands of lives across Shanghai and, as the purge spread, across other cities under nationalist control in the weeks that followed. The event effectively shattered the alliance between the nationalists and the communists, an alliance that had already been straining under the weight of irreconcilable goals, and it drove the surviving communist movement underground and into the countryside, where it would spend the next 2 decades rebuilding under leaders like Mao Zedong before eventually returning, in 1949, to claim the entire country. Some historians trace a direct, unbroken line from the blood spilled in Shanghai's streets in April 1927 to the final triumph of Communist China more than 20 years later, the argument being that the massacre, rather than crushing the communist movement outright, radicalized and hardened it, pushing it toward the rural, guerrilla-based strategy that would eventually prove unstoppable. For Du Yuesheng personally, the massacre was not an act of moral catastrophe requiring atonement or hiding. It was, in the cold ledger of underworld ambition, the single most profitable transaction of his entire career. Chiang Kai-shek did not forget who had delivered Shanghai to him free of its most dangerous internal threat. In the aftermath of the purge, as Chiang consolidated his new national government and began the work of governing not just Shanghai but, eventually, much of China, Du Yuesheng found himself rewarded in ways that transformed his status permanently. He was no longer simply the most powerful gangster in the French concessions underworld, tolerated by foreign police who took his bribes and looked the other way. He was, now, a man with a direct personal relationship to the head of the Chinese national government, a man whose loyalty in a moment of genuine crisis had been proven beyond any question, and a man who could therefore expect, and receive, protections and privileges that no amount of silver alone could ever have purchased. Among the rewards that followed was an appointment that reads, on its face, like the punchline to an especially dark joke, and yet is entirely, historically true. Du Yuesheng was given a position on the Shanghai government's own anti-opium board, the very body ostensibly created to combat the opium trade that Du himself had spent the better part of a decade building into a near-total monopoly. It was corruption of a kind so brazen, so almost theatrical in its cynicism, that it tells you everything you need to know about the nature of governance in Chiang's China during these years. Chiang understood exactly what he was doing when he handed Du this position. It was not an oversight or a naive failure to vet an appointee. It was a deliberate gift, a formal, government-sanctioned monopoly on the opium trade dressed up in the language of prohibition and public health, allowing Du and Huang, already the city's dominant opium distributors, to use their new official authority to systematically dismantle whatever competition remained, all under the protective cover of appearing to fight the very trade they controlled. Du Yuesheng's opium empire, already vast, now became something closer to an arm of the state itself, untouchable not merely because of bribed French policemen in a foreign concession, but because the head of the Chinese national government had a personal, political debt to the man running it, and had structured the very apparatus of anti-opium enforcement to protect him rather than prosecute him. What makes this chapter of Du Yuesheng's life so unsettling to sit with, even a century later, is not simply the brutality of what happened on the night Wang Shouhua died, or the scale of the massacre that followed. It is the speed and completeness with which violence was converted into legitimacy. A man strangled in a private residence by hands that had shaken his own only hours before. Thousands of workers gunned down in the streets of a city that had, days earlier, believed itself on the verge of liberation. And out of that horror, a gangster's formal elevation into the machinery of the state, a criminal handed the keys to the very institution meant to police his crime. Du Yuesheng did not simply survive the chaos of 1927. He was, in the truest sense, made by it, transformed from a powerful but ultimately provincial underworld figure into a man of genuine national consequence, a kingmaker whose fortune and influence would now expand far beyond the borders of Shanghai's foreign concessions and into the corridors of Chinese national power itself. He had blood on his hands that would never wash off, blood belonging not to a rival gangster in some private turf dispute but to a labor movement, a political faction, and, in the judgment of many historians since, to the future of an entire nation's trajectory. And he had, in exchange, secured for himself something that money and muscle alone had never been able to buy in all his years climbing out of the mud of Pudong, a seat, however unofficial, at the table of the men who ruled China. But power built on a debt like that is never entirely stable, and gratitude among men who have just proven themselves capable of ordering a massacre is a currency that spends quickly and unpredictably. In the years that followed the Shanghai massacre, Du Yuesheng would need every bit of the cunning that had carried him from a fruit cart to a mansion, because the wealthier, more powerful, and more politically entangled he became, the more enemies gathered in the shadows around him, rival gangsters resentful of his dominance, foreign authorities increasingly uneasy about the scale of what he had built, and a Chinese public that, whatever fear it held for him, had not forgotten whose hands had been on Wang Shouhua's throat. There is a particular kind of ambition that only shows itself once a man has already gotten everything he thought he wanted. Du Yuesheng, by the early 1930s, possessed more wealth than his father the failed rice merchant could have imagined in 100 lifetimes. He possessed more raw physical safety than almost anyone in Shanghai, protected by French police on one side and the national government of China on the other, a man effectively immune to the ordinary consequences that governed lesser criminals. He possessed fear, total, absolute fear, the kind that made merchants pay without being asked twice and made rivals think 3 times before crossing him. And somewhere in the years following the massacre that had cemented his political standing, Du Yuesheng discovered that fear and money and safety were not, in fact, enough. What he wanted next was something far stranger and, in its own way, far more difficult to buy: respectability. This is the part of Du Yuesheng's story that even people who know the broad outline of his career tend to find genuinely startling, because it does not fit the tidy narrative that gangster stories usually follow. He was not content to be feared from a distance, whispered about in tea-houses, treated as an unavoidable but shameful fact of Shanghai life. He wanted to be seen at the front of the room. He wanted his name on the donor plaques of hospitals. He wanted scholars and opera stars and newspaper editors to owe him favors of the pleasant kind, not merely the frightened kind. He wanted, in the deepest sense, to matter to a Shanghai that extended beyond the walls of his opium dens, and over the course of the 1930s, with the same patience and organizational genius that had built his criminal monopoly, he built a second empire on top of the first, an empire of image, of civic standing, of carefully cultivated legitimacy that would eventually make him one of the most recognized and, in certain circles, genuinely respected men in the entire city. The mechanism he used to build this second empire was philanthropy, and he pursued it with the same scale and seriousness he had once brought to consolidating the opium trade. He did not make small, symbolic gestures. He built institutions. He funded hospitals that treated ordinary Shanghai residents who had no other access to medical care, residents who had never smoked a pipe in one of his dens and never would, but who nonetheless found themselves alive because Du Yuesheng's money had built the clinic down the street. He established and funded schools, providing education to children whose families could never otherwise have afforded it, planting his name and his generosity into the memory of a generation of Shanghai residents who would grow up associating Du Yuesheng not primarily with opium and murder but with the school building where they had learned to read. He became, in time, vice president of the Chinese Red Cross Society, a position that placed him at the center of disaster relief efforts across the region, flood relief, famine relief, refugee assistance, work that was neither symbolic nor cosmetic but genuinely, materially significant to thousands of desperate people who received food, shelter, and medical attention because of infrastructure Du Yuesheng had helped fund and organize. It would be too simple, and too flattering to him, to call this pure hypocrisy and leave it there, and it would be equally naive to call it pure altruism. The truth sits in the uncomfortable middle, the way it usually does with men like Du Yuesheng. The philanthropy was genuinely useful to the people who received it. A child who learned to read in a Du-funded school did not care, and likely did not know, that the money had originated in opium profits and gambling tables. But the philanthropy was also, unmistakably, a strategy, and Du Yuesheng understood its strategic value with total clarity. Every hospital wing that bore his influence, every flood relief effort he helped organize, every scholarship he funded was a brick in the wall he was building between his old identity as a feared gang boss and his new, carefully constructed identity as a pillar of Shanghai society, a man whose wealth, however it had been accumulated, was now being turned toward the public good, a man whose name could be spoken in polite company without automatically summoning images of opium smoke and strangled labor leaders. The strategy worked, spectacularly. Du Yuesheng became chairman of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, a position of genuine economic influence that placed him at the center of Shanghai's Chinese business community, negotiating on behalf of merchants and industrialists in a way that had nothing directly to do with his underworld operations and everything to do with the kind of legitimate civic authority that even wealthy legitimate businessmen rarely achieved. He moved into banking, taking positions on the boards of Chinese financial institutions, lending his name, his connections, and his very particular skill at making problems disappear to the world of legitimate finance. He was appointed to advisory councils connected to the French concession's own governing apparatus, a staggering evolution for a man whose entire fortune had been built on paying French police to ignore his crimes. Now he sat, in some capacity, on the very councils that shaped how the concession would be governed. Less a criminal being tolerated by the authorities and more a genuine power broker whom the authorities needed to consult. He cultivated the world of Chinese opera and traditional culture with real enthusiasm and real money, becoming a patron whose support could make or break a performer's career in Shanghai, filling his social circle with actors, musicians, and artists who found in Du not merely a source of funding but, by many accounts, a genuinely engaged audience, a man who had grown up with nothing, who had never received a formal education, and who seemed to take real pleasure in surrounding himself with the cultural sophistication that had been entirely absent from his childhood in the mud of Pudong. Scholars, too, found their way into his orbit, men of genuine classical education who might once have looked down on a gangster of Du's origins but who increasingly found reasons, financial, professional, sometimes simply social, to accept his patronage and, in accepting it, to lend his name a kind of intellectual credibility that no amount of silver could otherwise have purchased. There is a particular story, retold often enough in accounts of his life to be worth including here, that captures something essential about how Du Yuesheng understood his own transformation. He is said to have remarked, in one form or another, that there were three kinds of men in Shanghai worth being, the kind who fought with fists, the kind who fought with money, and the kind who fought with words and reputation, and that he had spent the first half of his life mastering the first two only to discover, too late for it to come naturally, that the third was the one that actually determined how history would remember a man. Whether the quote is precisely accurate or has been polished by decades of retelling almost doesn't matter, because it captures a truth that runs through every decision he made in these years. he was no longer satisfied simply holding power. He wanted power that looked, from a certain angle and in a certain light, like grace. Nowhere was this ambition for respectability more visible than in the extraordinary project he undertook back in the village of his birth. Gaoqiao, the marshland settlement in Pudong where Du Yuesheng had once run barefoot as a parentless boy selling fruit from a cart, became the site of one of the most lavish displays of filial and civic monument building that Republican-era China had seen from a single private individual. Du financed and built an enormous ancestral hall there, a structure of genuine grandeur, dedicated to honoring his family lineage in the traditional Confucian manner that any respectable, established Chinese family of wealth and standing would have been expected to maintain. The construction and dedication of the hall became a citywide event, drawing dignitaries, officials, and prominent figures from across Chinese society and even beyond it. Accounts describe representatives and well-wishers arriving from figures of national and even international standing, an almost unimaginable turn for a project honoring the ancestors of a man born into a family too poor to keep him fed. It was, in the most literal sense, a former fruit seller building a monument to his own ancestors so grand that it forced the entire respectable establishment of China to show up and pay their respects to him. This was Du Yuesheng at the peak of his powers of self-transformation, a man capable of moving simultaneously and comfortably through two entirely separate worlds that, in any honest accounting, should have been incompatible. In one world, he remained the absolute lord of Shanghai's vice economy, still overseeing opium dens, gambling houses, and protection rackets that generated enormous illicit wealth and inflicted real, ongoing suffering on the addicts, the ruined gamblers, and the frightened shopkeepers who lived under his shadow. In the other world, he sat on hospital boards, funded schools, brokered peace between rival merchants, and hosted scholars and opera stars in salons where his origins in the mud of Pudong were spoken of, if at all, as an inspiring rags to riches story rather than the origin point of a criminal empire. Both of these Du Yueshengs were, simultaneously and without contradiction in his own mind, entirely real. His domestic life during these years reflected the same expansive, almost imperial scale as everything else he built. He maintained multiple households and, over the course of his life, married several wives, a practice not unusual among wealthy and powerful men of his era and social position, and his residences became legendary in their own right, sprawling properties staffed by servants, guarded by his ever-present bodyguards, and furnished with the accumulated wealth of 2 decades at the top of Shanghai's underworld economy. He entertained on a scale that matched or exceeded that of the foreign taipans and Chinese industrial magnates who represented Shanghai's other, more conventionally legitimate elite, and increasingly, those same taipans and magnates found themselves genuinely eager to be included on Du's guest lists, not out of fear alone, though fear was never entirely absent from any relationship with Du Yuesheng, but because inclusion in his social world had itself become a marker of status in Shanghai, a sign that one had arrived. And yet underneath all of this glittering reconstruction of his public image, the darker machinery never stopped running, and Du Yuesheng never allowed himself to forget which machinery had built the foundation everything else stood on. His own personal habits told the story most honestly of anyone's account could. By these years, Du Yuesheng had become heavily addicted to opium himself, a habit that had grown, by most accounts, directly out of his decades of intimate proximity to the trade he controlled, the drug always within arm's reach, the temptation of a product he had spent his entire adult life selling to others eventually claiming him as well. It is one of the story's bitterest ironies, the Opium King of Shanghai, the man whose monopoly had addicted uncounted thousands of ordinary people across the city, himself unable to escape the grip of the very product that had made him rich. Even at the absolute height of his public respectability, chairing chambers of commerce and funding hospital wings, he remained, privately, a man in the grip of the drug that had built his empire, a walking embodiment of the trade's true cost that no amount of philanthropy could fully disguise from those who knew him closely. His enforcement apparatus, too, remained as brutal as it had ever been, running quietly beneath the surface of his new civic respectability. Those who crossed Du Yuesheng in these years of his supposed transformation into gentleman philanthropists still disappeared, still suffered, still learned in the most direct and physical terms what it meant to have offended the wrong man in Shanghai. The mechanisms of intimidation that had built his fortune in the 1920s did not retire simply because their architect had begun sitting on hospital boards. If anything, his growing legitimacy made the threat of his enforcers more effective, not less. A man who could destroy you through official channels, through his connections to police and government and banking, was in some ways more terrifying than one who could only send thugs in the night, because there was no corner of respectable life left to run to for protection. By the mid-1930s, Yuesheng stood, by any honest measure, as one of the most powerful private individuals in the whole of China, a man who controlled a criminal empire worth staggering sums, who commanded genuine influence within the national government through his relationship with Chiang Kai-shek, who held real institutional power in banking and commerce, and who had constructed, through sheer force of will and patient strategy, a public reputation that allowed polite Shanghai society to receive him as an honored guest rather than shun him as the gangster he unquestionably remained underneath it all. He had done something that very few criminals in history have managed to do at this scale. He had made himself, in the eyes of a significant portion of his own society, not merely tolerable but admirable, a philanthropist and statesman whose criminal foundations were treated, by those who benefited from his generosity or feared his displeasure, as an inconvenient footnote rather than the central fact of his existence. But history, as it so often does, was about to test every carefully constructed piece of that image in the harshest way imaginable. Across the sea, an empire was rising with ambitions of its own toward China, ambitions that would soon bring war to Shanghai's doorstep in a form more devastating than anything the city's underworld had ever produced. When the bombs began falling and the soldiers began marching, Yuesheng, opium lord, philanthropist, gangster, power broker, would be forced to make choices that no amount of money or reputation could soften, choices between collaboration and resistance, between profit and country, that would define the final and most dramatic chapter of his rise before the long, slow fall that was still to come. The Japanese invasion of Shanghai was coming. And Yuesheng, the boy who had once watched the river from the mudflats of Pudong, was about to discover exactly what his empire was worth when the city he owned was no longer his to protect. Shanghai in the summer of 1937 was, on its surface, still the city Yuesheng had spent 30 years building his empire inside of, the nightclubs still glittering along the Bund, the opium dens still doing their quiet, profitable business in the alleys of the French concession, the sing-song houses still filled with music and money. But underneath that familiar surface, a pressure had been building for years, the way pressure builds beneath a fault line long before anyone above ground notices the ground beginning to tremble. Japan's imperial ambitions toward China had been advancing steadily through the 1930s, the seizure of Manchuria in 1931, the slow, methodical encroachment into northern China through the middle of the decade, each incursion met with protest from a Chinese government too fractured by its own internal war against the communists to mount an effective military response. And then, on the night of July 7, 1937, a confused skirmish between Chinese and Japanese troops near a bridge outside Beijing ignited into something that would not stop burning for 8 years. Full-scale war had come to China. And it would not spare Shanghai for long. The battle for Shanghai began on August 13, 1937, and it was, from its opening hours, unlike anything the city had ever experienced. This was not underworld violence contained to back alleys and private residences. This was industrial warfare, waged with artillery, bombers, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, fought street by street through neighborhoods that had, only weeks earlier, been ordinary residential districts full of shops and families. Japanese warships shelled the city from the Huangpu River. Japanese aircraft bombed Chinese-controlled districts, and in a horror that shocked even a city accustomed to violence, errant bombs intended for Japanese positions struck crowded civilian areas of the international settlement itself, killing hundreds of refugees and bystanders in a single afternoon in an incident that came to be remembered as one of the bloodiest days in the city's modern history. For 3 months, Chinese nationalist forces fought a desperate, costly defense of Shanghai, throwing some of their best-trained divisions into a battle they ultimately could not win against Japan's superior firepower and air superiority. By mid-November, Chinese forces had been driven from the city, and Shanghai, or at least its Chinese-administered districts, had fallen. For Yuesheng, the fall of Shanghai represented something far more personal and far more devastating than the loss of a battle in a war being fought by soldiers who were not his own. Shanghai was not merely the city where he happened to operate. It was the entire foundation of everything he had built across 3 decades: the opium dens, the gambling houses, the political relationships, the philanthropic institutions, the ancestral hall in Gaoqiao, the very geography of streets and alleys and concessions whose particular jurisdictional confusion had made his empire possible in the first place. Every part of his power depended on Shanghai remaining Shanghai, a city of overlapping foreign and Chinese authority, of bribable police and negotiable boundaries, of the specific chaotic order that Du Yuesheng had spent his entire adult life learning to navigate and exploit. A Shanghai occupied by an invading Japanese army, answering to Japanese military command rather than French colonial administrators or corrupt Chinese officials, was a fundamentally different city, one whose rules Du Yuesheng had no guarantee of understanding or controlling. He faced, in the autumn of 1937, a decision that would define the entire second half of his life, a decision with no comfortable option available to him. He could remain in Shanghai and attempt to negotiate the same kind of accommodation with the occupying Japanese authorities that he had spent decades negotiating with the French, trading cooperation and access to his networks for continued protection of his criminal empire, becoming, in effect, a collaborator whose vast underworld infrastructure would now serve an occupying foreign army rather than the fractured but at least nominally Chinese governments he had worked with before. Or he could abandon the city that had made him, walk away from the opium dens, the gambling houses, the mansions, the ancestral hall, everything he had spent his life building, and throw his lot in with the retreating nationalist government, following Chiang Kai-shek's regime into the unknown interior of China, sacrificing his empire on the gamble that resistance would eventually triumph and that loyalty demonstrated now would be repaid later. Du Yuesheng chose resistance. It is, of everything in his complicated and morally compromised life, the choice that his admirers point to most insistently as evidence that beneath the gangster there was something resembling genuine patriotism, and it is worth taking seriously, even while remembering that it was also, characteristically for Du, a choice that preserved his political relationships and his long-term strategic position as thoroughly as it demonstrated any pure loyalty to a nation that had never treated men of his origins particularly kindly. Before Shanghai fell, and in the desperate months as the battle raged, Du Yuesheng mobilized the vast underworld network he had spent 30 years building and turned a meaningful portion of it toward the war effort. His organization had long served as an informal enforcement arm for nationalist tax collection and fundraising within Shanghai's concessions, and as the war began, that same machinery was redirected toward funding and supplying Chiang's beleaguered military forces, using Du's extensive financial networks and his control over the flow of goods through the city to funnel resources toward the resistance. He worked closely in these years with Dai Li, the feared and formidable director of Chiang's intelligence and security apparatus, a relationship that connected Du's underworld networks directly into the machinery of nationalist espionage and covert operations. Through this partnership, Du's contacts, smugglers, dock workers, gang enforcers, informants scattered through every level of Shanghai's underworld, became assets in a shadow war against Japanese occupation, providing intelligence, facilitating sabotage, and disrupting Japanese supply lines in ways that a conventional army, fighting in the open, simply could not. When Shanghai finally fell in November 1937, Du Yuesheng did not stay to negotiate his empire's survival under Japanese occupation. He left the city that had made him, an extraordinary act for a man whose entire identity had been built, brick by brick, on his mastery of that specific urban landscape, and made his way, eventually, to Chongqing, the remote city in China's interior that Chiang Kai-shek's government had designated as its provisional wartime capital after the loss of Shanghai and later Nanjing. It is difficult to overstate how strange this must have felt for a man like Du Yuesheng, the undisputed king of the most sophisticated, cosmopolitan, foreign-influenced city in China, exiled now to a mountainous, comparatively provincial city in Sichuan province, far from the concessions, the nightclubs, the opera houses, and the intricate web of relationships he had spent his entire life cultivating. He had traded an empire for a war. In Chongqing, Du Yuesheng reinvented his usefulness once again, demonstrating the same adaptive intelligence that had carried him from a fruit cart to the top of Shanghai's underworld. He integrated his remaining criminal networks directly into the nationalist government's wartime security apparatus, working to enhance Chiang's capacity for surveillance and sabotage in Japanese-occupied territory, territory that, of course, now included the city he had once ruled. His organization's deep familiarity with smuggling routes, black markets, and the countless informal channels through which goods and information moved outside official oversight proved enormously valuable to a nationalist government fighting a war on a shoestring, cut off from its wealthiest and most industrialized territory. In 1939, he went further, organizing a coalition of secret societies under the explicit banner of anti-Japanese resistance, directing guerrilla harassment activities in Japanese-held territory that extended the reach of nationalist resistance efforts into regions where the regular army could not easily operate. And in occupied Shanghai itself, the Japanese authorities, well aware of exactly who Yuesheng was and exactly how valuable his cooperation would have been to them, made a direct and, in retrospect, remarkable overture. By 1939, Japanese officials extended an offer of safe passage and protection for Du to return to Shanghai, an offer that would have allowed him to resume control over his old opium networks, now with the explicit backing and protection of the occupying power itself, an arrangement that promised to be, in purely financial terms, extraordinarily lucrative, essentially restoring his entire empire under new management. It is worth pausing on this moment, because it represents the clearest test of where Yuesheng's loyalties actually sat when the easy path and the honorable path diverged completely. He turned the offer down. The historical record is honest enough to admit that the reasons behind this refusal remain somewhat murky, and it would be a disservice to Yuesheng's genuinely complicated character to pretend the decision was purely noble. Some historians have suggested it reflected real ideological commitment to Chiang and to the intelligence networks he had built with Dai Li, a sense of obligation to men he had fought alongside in the shadow war against Japan. Others note more practically that Du continued finding ways to smuggle opium into Japanese-controlled territory on his own terms rather than the terms Japan offered him, suggesting that even in refusing outright collaboration, he was still, at his core, a businessman unwilling to become merely an instrument of someone else's administration rather than the master of his own operation. Both explanations can be true simultaneously, and probably were. But whatever the precise mixture of patriotism and pragmatic self-interest, the practical outcome was unambiguous. Yuesheng spent the war years as an ally of the nationalist resistance rather than a collaborator with the Japanese occupation, at real cost to the empire he had spent his life building, and at real risk to himself. The war years were long and difficult, stretching across 8 brutal years of Japanese occupation and Chinese resistance, years during which Yuesheng, the man who had once been the single most powerful private individual in the wealthiest city in China, lived largely in exile from that city, operating from Chongqing and other locations in China's unoccupied interior. His opium empire fractured and diminished, his mansions and nightclubs and ancestral halls sitting under foreign occupation, hundreds of miles away. His health, never fully separate from his decades of opium addiction, suffered through these years as well, worn down by exile, by tuberculosis that would trouble him for the rest of his life, by the simple physical toll of aging in difficult conditions far from the comforts his wealth had once guaranteed him without question. When the war finally ended in 1945, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Yuesheng returned to Shanghai in a moment that, by every account, felt to him and to many Shanghai residents like a genuine homecoming and a vindication. He arrived back in the city on September 3, 1945, and received something approaching a hero's welcome, public recognition of his wartime contributions to the resistance, an acknowledgement that whatever his criminal history, whatever the darkness of his methods, he had chosen loyalty to China over collaboration with its occupiers when that choice actually mattered and actually cost him something real. For a man who had spent the better part of the 1930s carefully constructing a public image as a philanthropist and patriot layered over his criminal foundation, the war years had, in a strange and genuinely earned way, validated that image more thoroughly than any hospital donation or ancestral hall ever could have. But the Shanghai that Yuesheng returned to in 1945 was not the Shanghai he had left in 1937. 8 years of occupation, war, and economic devastation had reshaped the city in ways that would prove far more threatening to his empire than the Japanese occupation itself had been. The old order of French concession authorities and negotiable colonial jurisdiction that Du had spent his entire career learning to manipulate was crumbling, soon to disappear entirely as the era of foreign concessions in China drew toward its final end. His old rival and former partner Zhang Xiaolin had died during the war years under circumstances that remain disputed by historians, some suggesting assassination connected to accusations of collaboration with the Japanese, a grim reminder of how differently that same wartime choice, collaboration versus resistance, had played out for men who had once stood as equals in the triumvirate that ruled Shanghai's underworld. Huang Jinrong, the old master who had first elevated Du from a fruit-selling nobody decades earlier, was aging into irrelevance, a respected relic of an underworld order that the war and the coming political upheaval were rapidly making obsolete. And beyond even these personal losses, a far larger storm was gathering on China's horizon, one that would prove more dangerous to everything Yuesheng had built than the Japanese army had ever been. The uneasy wartime truce between the nationalists and the communists, forged out of necessity to fight the common enemy of Japan, was already fracturing before the war had even fully ended. China's civil war, the same conflict whose seeds had been planted in the blood spilled on the night Du's men strangled Wang Shouhua back in 1927, was reigniting, and this time, the communist forces that Chiang Kai-shek and Du Yuesheng had spent decades trying to crush were stronger, more organized, and more popular among an exhausted, war-ravaged Chinese population than they had ever been before. Du Yuesheng had returned to Shanghai as a war hero, restored to something resembling his former glory. But the political ground beneath the entire nationalist order he had bet his empire on for 2 decades was already beginning to shift in ways that no amount of money, muscle, or carefully cultivated respectability would be able to stop. The hero's welcome Du Yuesheng imagined when he returned to Shanghai in September 1945 never fully arrived, and the gap between what he expected and what he received was the first sign that the world he had ruled for 3 decades was no longer entirely his to command. Many ordinary Shanghai residents, it turned out, did not remember his wartime resistance activities with the gratitude he had hoped for. What they remembered instead was that Du Yuesheng, the richest, most powerful man in the city, a man with the resources to have stayed and organized resistance from within, or at minimum to have shared the suffering of the 8 brutal years of occupation, had left. He had gone to Chongqing, to safety, to the company of generals and ministers, while ordinary Shanghai residents endured Japanese occupation, rationing, brutality, and fear with no protector at all. It was an ungenerous reading of a genuinely complicated wartime record, but it was also, in its own way, an accurate one, and Du Yuesheng, a man who had spent 15 years carefully constructing a public image as Shanghai's benevolent patron, found himself returning to a city that greeted him with something closer to ambivalence than adoration. Still, he set about rebuilding. His financial empire, though diminished by the war, remained substantial. He had, by this point in his career, moved so thoroughly into legitimate finance that he sat as a director or supervisor at institutions as significant as the Bank of China and the Bank of Communications, held presidencies or directorships across more than 70 commercial organizations, and maintained leadership roles in over 200 separate enterprises and institutions scattered across Shanghai's economic landscape. He remained deeply embedded in the machinery of the Shanghai Municipal Council, still capable of maneuvering political appointments, still able to summon 100 municipal councillors to a banquet at his request, still, in the eyes of anyone doing business in the city, a man whose cooperation was essential and whose opposition was dangerous. In the spring of 1946, his political network proved its continuing strength when candidates aligned with his interests captured roughly half the seats on the reconstituted Shanghai Municipal Council in that year's elections, a remarkable demonstration that even in a post-war Shanghai supposedly moving toward more legitimate civic governance, the gangster's hand still shaped who held power. But grief and political erosion were both closing in on him at once. In March of 1946, his closest ally within the nationalist security establishment, Dai Li, the intelligence chief with whom Du had built such an intimate working partnership during the war years, a man Du considered something close to a sworn brother, died suddenly in an airplane crash. Du was devastated in a way that those who knew him described as genuinely, visibly shattered. He presided over Dai Li's memorial service in Shanghai and wept openly throughout it, an almost unthinkable public display of vulnerability from a man whose entire public identity for 30 years had been built on projecting unshakable control. He personally arranged for Dai Li's family to receive an enormous sum from funds the two men had jointly managed during the war, and years later, on a visit to Chongqing, he made an emotional pilgrimage to Dai Li's grave, a gesture that friends and biographers alike pointed to as evidence of a loyalty in Du Yuesheng that ran deeper than mere political calculation. The death cost him more than a friend. It cost him his single most important connection into the inner security apparatus of the nationalist government, a connection that had, for nearly a decade, given his underworld networks real standing at the highest levels of Chiang Kai-shek's regime. Without Dai Li, Du Yuesheng was, for the first time in 20 years, politically exposed in a way he had not been since before the 1927 massacre had cemented his relationship with Chiang. That exposure became catastrophically clear in 1948, in the middle of a nationalist government sliding rapidly and visibly toward collapse. China's economy by this point had entered a spiral of hyperinflation so severe it beggars description, currency devaluing not by the month but by the day, ordinary citizens carrying stacks of nearly worthless bills to buy a bag of rice, an entire society's savings evaporating in real time while the communist army steadily advanced across the countryside, winning battle after battle against a nationalist military riddled with corruption and collapsing morale. In August 1948, in a desperate bid to arrest the economic freefall, Chiang Kai-shek's government introduced a new currency, the gold yuan, accompanied by draconian price controls and a promise to crush the black market hoarding and speculation that officials blamed for accelerating the crisis. To enforce this campaign, Chiang dispatched his own son, Chiang Ching-kuo, to Shanghai with sweeping authority and an explicit mandate that became famous in its own blunt, theatrical phrasing: they would go after tigers, not flies, meaning the campaign would target not petty street vendors and small-time black marketeers, but the genuinely powerful figures whose hoarding and speculation were believed to be gutting the economy from the top. It did not take long for Chiang Ching-kuo's tiger hunt to arrive at Du Yuesheng's own doorstep, and this is one of the sharpest, most brutal ironies in Du's entire life story, the anti-corruption campaign launched by the son of the very man Du had helped install in power over 2 decades earlier, in the massacre that had made both of their fortunes politically possible, now turned its full force against Du's own family. In September 1948, Chiang Ching-kuo's agents arrested Du's own son, Du Weibing, along with a close and longtime associate, on charges connected to black market activity and hoarding tied to Du's business networks. It was an almost unthinkable humiliation, the son of the single most powerful gangster in the history of modern Shanghai, a man whose father had personally arranged the release of Chiang Kai-shek's own patron Huang Jinrong from custody a quarter-century earlier, now sitting in a jail cell on the orders of that same patron's son. Du Yuesheng did not simply absorb the humiliation quietly. He fought back in the one way he had always fought, not with violence this time, but with leverage, with the accumulated knowledge of decades spent watching exactly how power and corruption actually moved through the upper reaches of the nationalist government. He is said to have made clear, through channels that left no room for misunderstanding, that if his son's arrest proceeded and his networks were dismantled while the campaign conveniently ignored the far larger and far more politically protected corruption of Chiang's own extended family, the Kung and Sung relatives who had been enriching themselves through the war and its aftermath on a scale that dwarfed anything Du's organization had ever managed, he would ensure that information about those far more powerful families' embezzlement became public knowledge. It was blackmail delivered with the same cold precision Du had once used to consolidate Shanghai's opium trade, and it worked well enough to secure his son's eventual release. But the confrontation had exposed something that no amount of money or leverage could fully repair: the alliance between Du Yuesheng and the Chiang family, the partnership forged in blood in 1927 and sustained across 2 decades of war and political upheaval, was fundamentally, irreparably broken. Whatever gratitude Chiang Kai-shek had once felt toward the gangster who had delivered Shanghai to him now curdled, on both sides, into something closer to mutual suspicion. It hardly mattered anymore. The nationalist government that Du Yuesheng had bet his entire empire on for over 20 years was, by the winter of 1948 into 1949, disintegrating with a speed that stunned even seasoned observers of Chinese politics. Communist forces, having systematically ground down the nationalist military in a series of decisive campaigns across Manchuria and northern China through late 1948, were now advancing on the Yangtze River Delta itself, on Nanjing, the nationalist capital, and on Shanghai, the city that was the entire foundation of everything Du Yuesheng had ever built. The gold yuan reform had failed catastrophically, wiping out what remained of ordinary citizens' savings and destroying whatever public confidence still remained in Chiang's government. Nationalist officials, generals, and wealthy businessmen across the country were making, with increasing urgency, the same decision Yuesheng now faced: stay and risk whatever a communist victory would mean for men who had spent their careers as pillars of the old order, flee to the island of Taiwan where Chiang Kai-shek's government was already quietly preparing a final redoubt, or seek some third option entirely. For a man of Yuesheng's history, an opium lord whose entire fortune had been built on exploiting the poor and addicted, whose most infamous act had been orchestrating the murder of a labor leader and the massacre of hundreds of communist-aligned workers in 1927, a man whose name was, quite literally, associated in Communist Party memory with one of the movement's darkest early setbacks. The idea of simply remaining in Shanghai to await a communist victory carried obvious, mortal risk. And yet, in the strange, calculating way that had defined his entire career, Yuesheng did not simply flee blindly. As communist forces closed in on Shanghai through late 1948 and into early 1949, he reportedly opened quiet, indirect channels of communication with underground communist representatives operating within the city, testing whether some accommodation, some negotiated understanding, might be possible even for a man with his history. A final demonstration of the same pragmatic instinct for survival that had carried him through the fall of Huang Jinrong, the chaos of the 1927 massacre, and the Japanese occupation. Whatever these overtures produced, they did not produce enough confidence for Yuesheng to gamble his life and his remaining fortune on staying. Nor did he choose Taiwan, the destination that most of Chiang Kai-shek's loyal inner circle were now fleeing toward as the nationalist government prepared its final retreat to the island. This choice, too, is revealing. After everything, the blood spilled in 1927, the decades of political partnership, the wartime resistance, even the bitter falling out over his son's arrest, Yuesheng apparently no longer trusted, or no longer wished to bind his fate entirely to, the Chiang family's political fortunes. Perhaps he understood, with the same clear-eyed realism that had guided every major decision of his life, that on an island fully under Chiang's direct control, with nowhere left to run and no leverage left to negotiate with, a man with Du's history of blackmailing the Generalissimo's own relatives might find his position considerably less secure than it had ever been in the sprawling, cosmopolitan chaos of Shanghai. In April 1949, as communist forces stood on the verge of taking Shanghai itself, Yuesheng boarded a ship and left the city of his birth, the city of his rise, the city he had ruled in one form or another for nearly 30 years, and sailed for Hong Kong. He would never see Shanghai again. On May 27, 1949, communist forces took full control of the city, and the Shanghai that Yuesheng had known, the Shanghai of foreign concessions and negotiable colonial jurisdictions, of opium dens operating under bribed police protection, of gangster philanthropists sitting on Chamber of Commerce boards, the entire intricate ecosystem that had made a career like Du's possible in the first place, ceased to exist almost overnight, swept away by a new government with no tolerance whatsoever for the kind of criminal political hybrid power that Yuesheng had spent his life perfecting. He arrived in Hong Kong as an old man by the standards of his era, 60 years old, his health already badly compromised by decades of opium addiction and by tuberculosis that had been quietly worsening for years. Accounts of his final years in the British colony vary considerably, and the disagreement between them tells its own story about how difficult it is to pin down the truth of a life as layered in myth and calculation as Yuesheng's. Some who knew him in this period described a man living in something close to genuine financial hardship, his fortune scattered and diminished by the chaos of the Civil War, the collapse of the currency he had once helped manipulate, and the sheer difficulty of extracting wealth from a mainland China that no longer recognized his claims to anything. Others insisted he had, with characteristic foresight, managed to secure a substantial nest egg before the fall of Shanghai, enough to live comfortably, if far more modestly than the imperial splendor of his Shanghai mansions, in his final years of exile. What is not disputed is the physical and mental decline that overtook him in Hong Kong. The opium addiction that had shadowed him since his years managing dens in the French concession, the very addiction that stood as such a bitter monument to the trade that had made him, continued its slow work on his body. He began losing his eyesight. Those who visited him in these final years described a man whose once total command of every detail, every relationship, every angle of leverage in a room, had faded into something closer to confusion, occasional forgetfulness, the diminished awareness that friends and family delicately, and perhaps generously, attributed to age and illness rather than naming more directly. The man who had once memorized the precise loyalty and usefulness of every lieutenant in an empire spanning opium dens, gambling houses, banks, and government ministries now sat largely confined, his world narrowed from the whole of Shanghai down to a single room in a foreign colony he had never particularly wanted to call home. By 1951, in his failing health and clouded judgment, Yuesheng reportedly began to believe that it might finally be safe to return to the mainland, to go home, in whatever diminished form home could now take, to the country that had shaped and been shaped by every choice of his extraordinary life. Whether this belief reflected genuine political calculation, some fading hope of reconciliation with a communist government that had, in fact, shown no sign whatsoever of forgiving men with his history, or simply the wishful confusion of an old, sick man losing his grip on the reality of the world that had passed him by, is impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is that he never got the chance to test that belief. Yuesheng died in Hong Kong on August 16, 1951, felled at last by the long, slow consequences of the opium addiction that had defined so much of his life, the very substance that had built his empire finally claiming the man who built it. He was 62 years old. The boy who had once watched the Huangpu River from the mudflats of Pudong, who had sold fruit from a cart to survive, who had risen through strangled ambition and calculated violence and genuine, complicated generosity to become the single most powerful private citizen in the history of modern Shanghai, died far from the city that had made him, in a rented room in a foreign colony, blind, addicted, and uncertain, at the end, of whether he would ever see home again. He did not. There is one more detail from the final months of Yuesheng's life worth sitting with before we come to the end of this story, because it captures something essential about the man that no account of opium empires or political massacres quite manages to reach on its own. In 1950, a year before his death, in a rented apartment in a foreign colony, blind and dying and stripped of nearly everything he had spent a lifetime building, Yuesheng married again. His new wife was Meng Xiaodong, one of the most celebrated Peking opera performers of her generation, a woman whose artistry in male, old Sheng, roles had made her a legend on stages across China, and whose earlier marriage to the equally legendary performer Mei Lanfang had already made her one of the most famous women in the country. Du had been captivated by her talent and her presence for years, going back to his days as Shanghai's great cultural patron, and in the end, with his fortune scattered, his empire gone, his health failing, and his eyesight nearly extinguished, he chose to spend what remained of his life bound to her. It is difficult to read this final marriage as anything other than what it appears to be on its face, not a political calculation, not a strategic alliance of the kind that had defined so much of his life, but something close to genuine devotion, arriving, as it so often does, only at the very end. He died the following year, on August 16, 1951, in that rented room in Hong Kong, 62 years old, felled by the compounding weight of tuberculosis and the opium addiction that had shadowed him since his years managing dens for Huang Jinrong 3 decades earlier. There is a bitter, almost unbearable symmetry to that ending that deserves to be named plainly. The man who had built the single largest opium monopoly in the history of modern China, who had made an unimaginable fortune supplying the drug to hundreds of thousands of addicts across Shanghai, who had watched countless families destroyed by the very product flowing through his dens, died as one more casualty of that same substance, not shot by a rival, not executed by a tribunal, not even undone by his political enemies, but simply, quietly consumed from the inside by the poison he had spent his life selling. In his final will, drawn up as his health failed, Yuesheng divided what remained of his estate among his surviving wives and children. He had, across his lifetime, married multiple times and fathered numerous sons and daughters, a sprawling family scattered, by the time of his death, across Hong Kong, Taiwan, and wherever else the chaos of civil war and exile had carried them. But the fortune he left behind bore little resemblance to the imperial wealth of his Shanghai peak. Accounts differ, as they have differed on so many details of his final years, about exactly how much remained, but the consensus among those who studied his estate is that it was a fraction, a shadow, of what a man who had once directed the flow of opium, gambling, and finance across the wealthiest city in China might have been expected to leave behind. Some of his children faced real hardship in the years that followed, forced to build lives and careers from far humbler foundations than their father's name might have suggested. One son, by later accounts, worked as a miner in Australia and studied through genuine financial struggle before eventually returning to Taiwan to build a business of his own, a strange and almost poignant echo of his father's own beginnings as a penniless boy hustling to survive. Du Yuesheng's body did not remain in Hong Kong. 2 years after his death, in a gesture that speaks to just how much value Chiang Kai-shek's government still placed on the memory of the alliance that had once bound the two men together, however bitterly it had ended, Du's remains were transported to Taiwan and interred in a private cemetery in what is now Shiji district, on the outskirts of Taipei. The tomb built for him there was, and remains, a place of genuine solemnity and considerable expense, its inscription proclaiming, in the formal language reserved for men of honor and loyalty, the virtues of the man buried beneath it: filial devotion, righteousness, service to the nation. And in a detail that feels almost too poetic to be true, and yet is recorded faithfully in the accounts of those who have visited the site, the tomb was deliberately positioned to face northwest, out across the water, in the direction of the city he had ruled and lost and never saw again. Du Yuesheng, in death, still looks toward Shanghai. It is worth pausing here to reckon honestly with the man this story has spent 6 parts describing, because Du Yuesheng resists the easy categories that gangster stories usually settle into. He was not simply a monster, though he ordered killings, built an empire on addiction, and helped orchestrate a massacre that took thousands of lives and altered the trajectory of an entire nation's history. He was not simply a misunderstood patriot either, though his wartime resistance against Japan was genuine, costly, and, by the honest account of nearly every serious historian who has studied the period, real rather than performative. He built hospitals that saved lives and ran opium dens that destroyed them, often in the very same years, sometimes, one suspects, funded by the very same money passing through his hands on its way from one purpose to the other. He wept openly at a friend's funeral and coldly ordered the strangling of a labor leader in his own home. He climbed, with genuine brilliance and genuine ruthlessness, from a fruit cart in the mud of Pudong to a seat at the table of the men who governed China, and he died blind and diminished in a rented room in a foreign colony, having outlived the empire he built by exactly long enough to watch it collapse without him. History, unsurprisingly, has not been able to agree on how to remember him, and the disagreement itself tells you something important about how differently the same life can be read depending on which nation, which government, and which decade is doing the reading. In Taiwan, where the nationalist government he had allied himself with eventually fled and where his own remains were ultimately laid to rest, the post-war historical memory of Du Yuesheng has tended toward a kind of rehabilitation, an emphasis on his wartime resistance against Japan, his refusal of Japanese collaboration, his philanthropic institution building, his role as a patriot who chose loyalty to the Chinese nation over the far more lucrative path of accommodation with an occupying power. It is a version of Du Yuesheng that foregrounds the ancestral hall, the hospitals, the schools, the tearful devotion at Dai Li's grave, and treats the Opium Empire and the 1927 massacre as unfortunate, distant chapters overshadowed by the patriotism that came after. In mainland China, under the government whose founding movement Du Yuesheng had helped violently suppress in the streets of Shanghai in 1927, the historical memory runs in almost the opposite direction. Official accounts and state media there have tended to emphasize precisely what the Taiwanese memory downplays: the strangled body of Wang Shouhua, the armband gunman moving through workers' districts on the night of April 12, the thousands of laborers and organizers killed in the massacre and the purges that followed, the opium monopoly that addicted and impoverished untold thousands of ordinary Chinese citizens for the enrichment of a single criminal empire. In this telling, Du Yuesheng is not a complicated patriot with a dark past. He is a counter-revolutionary gangster whose entire life stands as an indictment of exactly the kind of corrupt, criminal entangled old order that the revolution existed to sweep away. Both versions are, in their own selective way, true. And both are, in their own selective way, incomplete, because the honest and uncomfortable truth about Du Yuesheng is that he was never one man pretending to be another. He was, simultaneously and without contradiction in his own understanding of himself, the opium lord and the philanthropist, the murderer and the mourner, the collaborator with power and the resister of occupation, the ruthless enforcer of monopoly and the genuine patron of struggling artists and scholars. He built his entire extraordinary career on the specific, peculiar conditions of a Shanghai caught between empires, Chinese and foreign, warlord and republic, gangster and government, a city whose fractured, overlapping jurisdictions created exactly the kind of gaps in power that a boy with nothing, no name, no education, no protector, could exploit with enough patience, enough cunning, and enough willingness to do whatever the moment required. When those conditions disappeared, first under Japanese occupation, then under a resurgent and increasingly disciplined nationalist state, and finally, decisively, under communist victory, the particular kind of empire Yuesheng had built no longer had anywhere left to exist. He did not fall because a rival gangster outmaneuvered him, or because the law finally caught up with him, or because his own cruelty consumed him from within, the way so many gangster stories conventionally end. He fell because the entire world that had made a man like him possible ceased to exist around him, all at once, in the span of a single catastrophic decade. That is, perhaps, the truest and darkest lesson sitting at the bottom of Yuesheng's story, the one that separates it from the simpler morality tales that gangster narratives often reach for. He was not undone by justice. He was undone by history itself moving on without him, a tide he had ridden brilliantly for 30 years finally receding and leaving him stranded, blind and dying, in a rented room, looking back at a city and an era that no longer had any use for men who had built their power in the space between empires. Every skill that had made him extraordinary, his patience, his cunning, his genius for finding leverage in jurisdictional chaos, his ability to be simultaneously respectable and feared, depended entirely on a world of overlapping, negotiable authority that the 20th century, in the end, simply refused to preserve. The forces that made Yuesheng possible were the same forces that, once spent, made his continued existence as anything but a fading memory impossible. His name has outlived him in ways that go well beyond the tomb in Taipei or the competing verdicts of rival governments. He has become, over the decades since his death, one of the defining figures of an entire genre of Chinese popular memory and storytelling, the subject of biographies, television dramatizations, films, and folk retellings that have kept the image of big-eared Du alive in the popular imagination of Chinese-speaking audiences around the world long after the Shanghai he ruled disappeared into history books and museum exhibits. He has become, in the decades since his death, something close to archetype, the gangster philanthropist, the criminal statesman, the man who proved that in the right city, at the right moment in history, the line between underworld and overworld could be walked, and even mastered, by someone willing to move fluidly between both. And perhaps that is the image worth leaving you with as this story closes, not the boy on the fruit cart, not the young enforcer collecting Huang Jinrong's opium profits, not even the gangster ordering Wang Shouhua's murder in his own parlor, but the old, blind man in a rented Hong Kong room, married in his final year to a woman whose art he had genuinely loved, dying of the very substance that had built his empire, his body eventually carried across the water to a tomb that faces, forever, toward a city that no longer wanted him and could no longer be reached. Yuesheng spent his entire extraordinary life mastering the art of being needed, by opium addicts, by frightened merchants, by rival gang bosses, by the head of the Chinese national government himself. In the end, in the room where he actually died, none of that mattered at all. He was simply a man, running out of time, looking back at everything he had built and lost, in a city he would never see again. Shanghai moved on without him. It always does. Every empire built in its alleys and its concessions, no matter how vast, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually finds the tide has turned and left it stranded on a foreign shore. Yuesheng understood that truth better than almost anyone who ever tried to rule that city. He had watched it happen to Huang Jinrong, watched it happen to Zhang Xiaolin, watched it happen to the nationalist government he had bet his life on. He simply never expected, perhaps, that it would happen to him too. But it always does. It always has. And somewhere on a hillside outside Taipei, a tomb still faces northwest across the water, toward a city that made a fruit seller into a king, and then, in the end, forgot he had ever been one. The lights of Shanghai went dark a long time ago. But the stories never really do. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the shadows next time.